He believed tonight would be another flawless performance, another standing ovation, another reminder that he was untouchable. But he had no idea he was about to awaken a past that would silence the entire room. The grand concert hall in downtown Chicago glowed under layers of crystal chandeliers, their warm golden light reflecting off polished marble floors that echoed softly beneath every step. Rows of velvet seats stretched endlessly, filled with patrons in tailored suits and elegant evening gowns, the quiet hum of expectation hanging thick in the air. At the center of it all stood Victor Langston, the name everyone had come to see, a pianist whose reputation had traveled far beyond state lines, a man critics called the future of classical mastery. His posture was perfect, his tuxedo sharply fitted, every detail of his presence carefully crafted to command respect before he even touched the keys. And yet, just a few feet away, moving unnoticed in the background, was Clara Bennett. She wore a simple navy work uniform, her sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, her hands holding a soft cloth as she wiped invisible dust from the edge of the grand piano. At 38, Clara had mastered the art of being unseen. Her movements were quiet, efficient, almost ghost-like, as if she existed only in the margins of other people's importance. Most of the staff barely acknowledged her, and the guests never noticed her at all. That was how it had always been. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant no questions. Invisible meant no one asked about the past she had carefully buried. Make sure that surface is spotless, a stage coordinator whispered sharply as he passed her, barely sparing her a glance. Clara nodded softly, her eyes steady, her voice barely above a breath. Of course. Across the stage, Victor flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Applause had always come easily to him. Recognition had followed him like a shadow. He thrived on it, fed by it, defined by it. As the audience settled, a hush began to fall, the kind that comes just before something important happens. The room seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting. Clara stepped back from the piano, inspecting her work, her fingers pausing for just a second longer than necessary on the polished wood. There was something almost reverent in that touch, something that didn't belong to a cleaning routine. But no one noticed. No one ever did. Victor turned, catching sight of her hand resting lightly on the instrument. His expression shifted, subtle at first, then sharpening into irritation. "You," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the quiet. Several heads turned. Clara froze, her hand slowly pulling away as she looked toward him. "Yes, sir." Her tone was calm, respectful, careful. Victor stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the stage, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a single dismissive glance. "Try not to linger where you don't belong," he said, his voice low but edged with something unmistakable. A few nearby musicians exchanged faint smirks. The distinction was clear. There were people who performed, and people who cleaned up after them. Clara gave a small nod, stepping back immediately. Understood. She turned to leave, but something in the way her fingers had rested on the piano lingered in Victor's mind. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't curiosity. It was familiarity. And that bothered him. He watched her walk a few steps away, then stopped her again. "Wait." The word hung in the air, sharper this time. The nearby staff paused, sensing a shift. Clara turned back slowly. "Yes." Victor tilted his head slightly, studying her with a new kind of interest, one that mixed amusement with something closer to challenge. "You handled that instrument like you've touched one before," he said, loud enough now for others to hear. A ripple of attention spread outward. Clara remained still. "Just cleaning it," she replied simply. A few quiet chuckles rose from the musicians behind Victor. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he said. "Cleaning." The word lingered, heavy with implication. The audience was beginning to notice now, whispers threading through the room. The spotlight hadn't even begun, and already something unexpected was unfolding. Victor glanced toward the piano, then back at Clara, an idea forming behind his gaze. One that carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had never been told no. "Tell me something," he continued, his voice lifting just enough to draw more attention. "Do you play?" The question hung there, simple on the surface, but loaded beneath. Clara hesitated for the briefest moment. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Something deeper. Something older. Not anymore, she said quietly. Victor's smile widened just slightly. Not anymore, he repeated, as if tasting the words. Around them, the room grew quieter, curiosity sharpening into anticipation. He glanced at the audience, then back at her, the beginnings of a spectacle forming in his mind. Well, he said, straightening his cuffs with deliberate calm. Maybe tonight's the night you start again. And somewhere beneath the chandeliers, beneath the polished image and the carefully constructed reputation, something invisible shifted. The kind of shift no one notices until it's far too late. Victor let the silence stretch just long enough for the room to lean in, his expression calm but calculating, the faintest hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his lips, as if he had just discovered an unexpected source of entertainment. The audience, dressed in tailored suits and polished heels, shifted in their seats, sensing that something unscripted was about to unfold. Clara stood still under the soft spill of stage light, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her posture composed in a way that did not match the role everyone believed she played. Go on, Victor said, his voice now carrying easily across the hall, smooth and deliberate. You said you used to play. I am sure everyone here would love a demonstration. A few quiet laughs echoed from the orchestra section, subtle but unmistakable. The line between invitation and mockery had already been crossed. Clara's gaze moved briefly across the audience, not searching for approval, not seeking escape, but measuring something deeper, something internal that no one else could see. This is not necessary, she replied gently, her voice steady, almost soft enough to disappear into the room. Victor's smile sharpened. On the contrary, he said, stepping aside from the piano with a graceful gesture that felt more like a command than an offer. It is exactly what this evening needs. The stage coordinator hesitated at the edge of the curtain, uncertain whether to intervene, but Victor's reputation carried weight, and no one dared disrupt his decisions in a room like this. The crowd was watching now, fully invested, their attention no longer fixed on the scheduled performance, but on the quiet woman being placed at the center of an unexpected spectacle. Clara exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if releasing something she had held for years. She stepped forward, each movement unhurried, her worn shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. The distance between her and the piano was only a few feet, but it felt longer, heavier, as if every step carried the weight of a life she had carefully kept hidden. Victor folded his arms loosely, observing with an air of confident amusement, certain that whatever happened next would only reinforce the image he had already constructed in his mind. Take your time, he added, his tone laced with polite condescension. We would not want to rush greatness. A ripple of quiet laughter followed, and then, as if guided by an unspoken cue, the room fell into a deeper silence. Clara reached the piano and paused. Her reflection shimmered faintly on the glossy black surface, distorted by the curve of the instrument, a version of herself that no longer matched the woman standing there. For a moment, her fingers hovered above the keys, not touching, not moving, suspended between past and present. Somewhere in the audience, a phone camera adjusted its focus. Someone whispered. Someone else held their breath. Victor tilted his head slightly, watching for hesitation, expecting it, almost waiting for her to step back, to retreat into the safety of invisibility where she belonged. But Clara did not retreat. Instead, she lowered herself onto the bench with quiet precision, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, her hands resting gently in her lap. There was no nervous fidgeting, no visible uncertainty, just stillness. And that stillness began to feel different, unsettling, unexpected. Victor's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, something subtle shifting behind his eyes, though he quickly masked it with the same composed confidence. Whenever you are ready, he said, his voice softer now, but still edged with control. Clara lifted her hands slowly, placing them above the keys again, her fingers curved naturally, instinctively, as though they remembered something long before her mind chose to acknowledge it. The air in the hall seemed to tighten, every small sound amplified by the anticipation pressing in from all sides. Then she closed her eyes. It was a small gesture, almost unnoticeable, but it changed everything. Because in that moment, She was no longer the woman they had watched wiping down the piano. She was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere none of them could see. Victor's jaw tightened just slightly, an almost imperceptible reaction, but enough to betray that something about this was no longer amusing in the way he had intended. The seconds stretched, one after another, until the silence itself became heavy. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, Clara moved. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a single, deliberate motion as her fingers pressed down on the first key. A sound emerged, soft but clear, cutting through the silence like a thread pulled taut. It lingered in the air, pure and controlled, and for the first time that evening, no one laughed. Victor's smirk faded, replaced by something far more uncertain as he watched her hands remain poised, ready to continue. The room did not move. No one spoke. And in that fragile, suspended moment between the first note and the next, something invisible shifted again, something deeper, something irreversible. Because whatever Victor had expected, this was not it. The second note followed the first without hesitation, and then a third, each one placed with such quiet precision that the air itself seemed to listen more carefully. What began as a single sound unfolded into a melody that did not ask for attention. It commanded it, not through force, but through control so refined it felt almost effortless. Clara's fingers moved with a calm certainty that no longer belonged to the woman they had dismissed minutes earlier. Every motion was deliberate, every transition seamless, as if the music had been waiting for her, not the other way around. Victor's posture shifted, subtly at first, his folded arms loosening as his eyes narrowed, tracking her hands with a focus that replaced his earlier amusement. This was no longer a joke he controlled. The melody deepened, expanding into layers that revealed a complexity impossible to fake, impossible to stumble into by accident. It was not just technically correct, it was expressive in a way that carried memory, discipline, and something far more personal beneath the surface. A woman in the front row lowered her program slowly, her lips parting as if she had forgotten to breathe. Somewhere in the back, a phone that had been raised to record the moment dipped slightly, its owner no longer certain what they were witnessing. Clara's eyes remained closed, her face calm, untouched by the tension filling the room. But beneath that calm, something else had awakened, something that had not been seen in years. Her hands began to move faster now, not rushed, but confident, navigating the keys with a familiarity that spoke of countless hours, countless nights, countless sacrifices no one in that room had ever imagined. Victor took a step closer without realizing it, drawn in despite himself, his gaze locked onto the keyboard, as if searching for a mistake that refused to appear. Instead, what he found was something far more unsettling. Recognition. The pattern of the notes, the progression of the melody, the phrasing that shaped each line, it was not unfamiliar to him. It was impossible. He had studied this structure, performed variations of it, built part of his reputation on pieces that carried the same signature depth. But this was different. This was the origin. The room grew heavier with every passing second, the silence between notes no longer empty but charged, filled with a tension that no one dared interrupt. Even the air conditioning seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of Clara's playing and the collective stillness of an audience that had stopped judging and started listening. Victor's jaw tightened as a realization began to form, slow and unwelcome, threading its way through his certainty. He glanced briefly at the other musicians, expecting to see confusion or skepticism mirrored in their faces, but what he found instead was something closer to awe. One violinist leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide, her bow resting forgotten in her lap. A conductor near the stage edge lowered his hands completely, no longer pretending this was anything less than extraordinary. Clara's tempo shifted again, building now, not in volume but in intensity, each note connecting to the next with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not someone remembering how to play. This was someone who had never truly forgotten. Victor felt a faint tightening in his chest, not fear, not yet, but something that disrupted the control he had carried into this moment. He had expected hesitation, mistakes, a polite failure that would reaffirm the boundaries he believed in. Instead, he was witnessing something that refused to fit within those boundaries at all. Clara's fingers crossed over one another with fluid ease, executing a passage that required not just skill, but instinct, the kind of instinct that could not be taught in lecture halls or refined through applause. It had to be lived. It had to be earned. And as the melody rose into a sequence Victor knew all too well, his breath caught for the briefest second. Because he had played this before. Not exactly like this. Never like this. But close enough to know what came next. Except, Clara did not follow the version he knew. She altered it, expanded it, revealing a continuation that he had never seen written, never heard performed, yet somehow felt undeniably complete. The realization hit him not as a sudden shock, but as a slow unraveling of certainty. The piece he thought he understood was only a fragment, and the woman he had dismissed as invisible was playing it as if she had written every note herself. The room did not move. No one dared to interrupt the unfolding truth taking shape in sound. Victor stood there, no longer the center of attention, no longer the one in control, his presence reduced to that of a witness in a moment he could neither predict nor stop. And as Clara's hands continued across the keys, steady and unshaken, one question began to surface in his mind, quiet but impossible to ignore. Who was she? The melody did not slow down. It evolved, unfolding into something far more intricate than anything the audience had expected from a moment that began as mockery, and now every second that passed tightened the invisible grip it held over the room. Clara's hands moved with a quiet authority that no longer asked permission to exist, each note landing exactly where it needed to, each phrase building into the next with a precision that made it impossible to look away. The longer she played, the clearer it became that this was not performance alone. This was authorship, intention, ownership. Victor stood motionless, his earlier confidence dissolving piece by piece as the structure of the music revealed something he could not explain away. He knew this composition, or at least he believed he did, but what Clara was playing went beyond every version he had studied, every arrangement he had performed, every interpretation he had claimed as his own. This was not a variation. This was the original voice behind it. A faint murmur rippled through the audience, quickly swallowed by the weight of the moment, as if even whispering felt inappropriate in the presence of what was unfolding. Clara's tempo rose slightly, not rushed, but deliberate, guiding the melody into a passage so technically demanding that even seasoned musicians in the room leaned forward unconsciously, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief. A pianist seated near the aisle shook his head slowly, almost involuntarily, as if trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he knew to be possible. Victor's eyes remained locked on Clara's hands, searching, analyzing, trying to find a flaw, a hesitation, anything that would restore the order he understood. But there was none. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, a consistency so complete it felt effortless. His mind began to retrace the origins of the piece he had built part of his reputation on, the one critics had praised him for interpreting with such depth, the one that had elevated his name in concert halls across the country. It had always been described as anonymous, a rare composition with no confirmed author, passed through fragmented recordings and incomplete manuscripts. He had filled in the gaps. He had made it his own. Or at least, that was what he believed. Until now. Clara's fingers shifted into a sequence he had never seen documented, never heard performed, yet it resolved the composition in a way that felt undeniable, as if every missing piece had just been placed exactly where it belonged. The realization settled in slowly, heavy, and unavoidable. This was not a lost piece. It was a forgotten one, and the person playing it was not discovering it. She was remembering it. Victor took another step closer, his breath shallow, his control slipping in ways he could no longer hide. This is not possible, he murmured under his breath, though no one responded, no one moved, no one dared break the silence that had taken hold of the entire hall. Clara's expression remained unchanged, her eyes still closed, her posture steady, untouched by the weight of recognition forming around her. But beneath that calm, something deeper was unfolding, something long buried now rising with every note she played. The chandeliers above cast a soft glow across the stage, reflecting off the piano's surface, illuminating the contrast that now felt impossible to ignore. The woman they had dismissed as invisible was no longer blending into the background. She was defining the moment itself. As the melody reached its peak, the final sequence approached, a passage Victor knew should end in a certain way, a familiar resolution that audiences had come to expect. But Clara did not follow that path. Instead, she extended it, her hands moving with unwavering certainty into a closing progression that no one in the room had ever heard before, yet felt instantly complete, as if it had always been meant to end this way. The final note resonated through the hall, lingering in the air long after her fingers lifted from the keys. And then, nothing. No applause. No movement. Just silence. The kind of silence that does not come from uncertainty, but from realization. Victor stood frozen, his expression no longer composed, no longer controlled, but stripped of the certainty he had carried onto that stage. His voice, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. Where did you learn that? The question hung there, fragile, almost hesitant. Clara opened her eyes slowly, her gaze lifting to meet his for the first time since the music began. And in that single look, calm, steady, unshaken, the answer was already there. Not taught, not borrowed, not discovered, but his mind was not ready to accept it. Not yet. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, heavy and undeniable, as if the entire room needed time to process what had just happened. And in that silence, Victor felt something unfamiliar settle over him. Not embarrassment alone, but a quiet unraveling of everything he had been certain about. His question still lingered in the air, fragile now, stripped of the authority it once carried. Clara did not rush to answer. She simply held his gaze, steady and composed, her expression neither proud nor defensive, just calm in a way that made the truth feel even more inescapable. Around them, the audience remained frozen, eyes moving between the two of them, waiting for something to explain what they had just witnessed. Victor swallowed slightly, the subtle motion betraying the shift inside him. That piece, he said again, his voice lower this time, searching for footing. It is not published. There are only fragments. I have studied every version that exists. Clara's eyes softened, not with sympathy, but with recognition of something he had not yet fully understood. Yes, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. There are only fragments. A faint ripple moved through the audience, the kind that comes when a truth begins to surface but has not yet fully revealed itself. Victor took another step closer, his earlier distance gone, replaced by an urgency he could not mask. Then how did you? He began, but the question trailed off, because even as he spoke it, he was beginning to realize there was only one answer that made sense. Clara lowered her hands slowly from the piano, resting them gently in her lap, as if the music had simply returned to where it had always belonged. Because it was never meant to be fragments, she said, her tone steady, almost reflective. It was never finished. The words settled into the room with a weight that shifted everything. Victor's brow furrowed, his mind racing, trying to piece together a conclusion he was not prepared to accept. What are you saying? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper now, the confidence that once defined it completely gone. Clara took a small breath, not out of hesitation, but as if stepping into a truth she had kept silent for far too long. I wrote it, she said. There was no emphasis, no dramatic pause, no need to convince. The simplicity of her statement carried more power than any performance ever could. For a moment, nothing happened. The room did not react. It simply absorbed. And then, slowly, the realization began to spread. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, her eyes widening. One of the musicians shifted in his seat, glancing at Victor as if waiting for him to deny it, to correct it, to restore the version of reality they all understood. But Victor did not speak. He could not, because in that instant, everything aligned in a way that left no room for doubt. The phrasing, the extensions, the parts of the composition that had never been documented but felt complete in her hands. He had heard them before, not in sound, but in the gaps he had tried to fill, the spaces he had interpreted, the missing pieces he had unknowingly built his reputation around. And now, standing in front of him, was the person who had never needed to interpret them at all. Clara Bennett. Not a cleaner, not an outsider, but the origin. Victor's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension that had once fueled his confidence now replaced by something far quieter, far heavier. That is not possible, he said finally, though the words lacked conviction, sounding more like an echo of the certainty he had already lost. Clara did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, grounded in something he could not challenge. It has been a long time, she said, her voice soft but clear, since anyone asked who wrote it. The room went completely silent again, but this time it was different. It was not anticipation. It was understanding. Victor glanced down at the piano, then back at her, the weight of his earlier words pressing against him in a way he could no longer ignore. The moment replayed in his mind, his tone, his assumptions, the ease with which he had reduced her to something insignificant. And now, standing in front of her, he could not find a single word that would restore that position. Around them, the audience shifted again, but no one spoke, no one interrupted, as if they all recognized that they were witnessing something far beyond a performance. Clara slowly stood from the bench, her movements calm, unhurried, as if nothing about this moment needed to be forced. She stepped away from the piano, returning to the space she had occupied before, but nothing about her felt invisible anymore. Victor watched her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer superior, but searching, as if trying to understand how he had missed something so significant standing right in front of him. Why? He began, then stopped, the question incomplete because he did not yet know what he was asking. Why had she remained silent? Why had she walked away? Why had no one known? Clara paused, just briefly, her gaze shifting toward the piano one last time before she looked back at him. Some things are not lost, she said quietly. They are simply left behind. And in that moment, beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by a room that had once belonged to him, Victor Langston realized something he had never considered before. Recognition does not create greatness. It reveals it. And for the first time in his life, he was no longer the one being revealed. The weight of her words did not fade. It settled deeper, threading through the silence that still held the entire hall in place. And for the first time that evening, Victor did not look like the man who controlled the room. He looked like someone standing inside a truth he could not reshape. His eyes lingered on Clara, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that might soften what she had just revealed, but there was none. She stood with quiet certainty, not demanding belief, not seeking recognition, simply existing in a way that no longer allowed her to be dismissed. Around them, the audience began to shift, not in noise, but in awareness, the kind that spreads slowly when perception changes all at once. A man near the center row leaned forward, whispering something to the person beside him, but even that whisper carried restraint, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile clarity forming in the room. Victor's hands, once so composed, now rested at his sides without purpose, his posture no longer anchored by confidence, but by something far more uncertain. If that is true, he said finally, his voice careful, measured, then why has no one ever heard your name? The question was not sharp, not accusatory, but searching, almost pleading for a version of reality that would restore balance. Clara's expression did not change. She had heard questions like this before, though rarely spoken aloud in rooms like this. Because names are only remembered when they are repeated, she replied softly, her voice steady enough to carry across the quiet. And sometimes they stop being repeated. The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any explanation could. Victor frowned slightly, his mind moving through possibilities, each one less convincing than the last. That does not happen to something like this, he said, gesturing faintly toward the piano, toward the music that had just filled the room. Work like that does not just disappear. Clara's gaze shifted briefly toward the instrument, not with longing, but with acknowledgement, as if recognizing a part of herself that had been left behind. It does, she said, when the person who created it chooses to walk away. A subtle tension moved through the audience again, not disbelief this time, but curiosity, deeper and more personal. Victor took in a slow breath, his composure returning in fragments, though it was no longer the same confidence he had carried before. People do not walk away from that, he said, his voice quieter now, less certain. Clara looked back at him, her eyes steady, holding a truth he had never needed to consider. Some do, she answered, when what they love no longer belongs to them. The words landed with quiet force, and for a moment, Victor did not respond. He glanced down at the piano again, at the keys that had just revealed something he could not unhear, then back at Clara, as if trying to reconcile the image of the woman before him with the reality she represented. "You expect me to believe," he said slowly, "that you wrote one of the most studied pieces in modern classical interpretation, and then you just left it behind." Clara did not react to the skepticism in his tone. She had lived beyond it for too long to be affected by it now. "I did not leave the music," she said. "I left the world that required me to prove it." The room absorbed her words in silence, the meaning unfolding in layers that reached far beyond the surface. Victor's expression shifted again, not into denial, but into something closer to reflection, as if pieces of his own journey were being quietly rearranged in light of hers. "And no one came looking?" he asked, almost to himself. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Not the right people." That answer lingered longer than any of the others, because it carried something Victor could not ignore. It was not about recognition. It was about who chooses to recognize. Around them, the atmosphere had changed completely. The earlier anticipation, the subtle arrogance of expectation, had dissolved into something far more grounded. Respect. Not the kind that is given freely, but the kind that arrives when assumptions are stripped away. Victor straightened slightly, though not in the same way he had before. There was no performance in it now, no need to reclaim the spotlight. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, subtle but unmistakable. "Then why now?" he asked, his voice steady, but no longer challenging. Clara glanced toward the audience, then back at him, her expression calm, almost reflective. "I did not plan for now," she said. "You did." The words landed gently, but their meaning was sharp. Victor inhaled slowly, the realization settling in with a clarity he could not escape. This moment, this shift, this exposure of truth, it had not been orchestrated by her. It had been triggered by him, by his assumption, by his certainty, by his need to define someone else before understanding them. The room remained silent, but it was no longer empty. It was full of something unspoken, something shared. Clara took a small step back, not retreating, but returning to herself, to the quiet space she had occupied before, though nothing about her felt unseen anymore. Victor watched her, the distance between them now measured not in steps, but in understanding. And in that moment, standing in the same place where he had once been certain of everything, he realized something far more difficult than being wrong. He realized he had never even asked the right question. The question lingered in Victor's mind long after Clara stopped speaking, echoing in a way that left no room for the certainty he once carried. And for the first time in his career, he stood in front of an audience without knowing what to say next. The silence in the hall shifted again, no longer heavy with tension, but charged with expectation, as if the room itself was waiting to see what he would do now that the roles had quietly reversed. Victor glanced toward the piano, then back at Clara, the distance between them no longer defined by status, but by understanding he had yet to reach. He had spent years mastering performance, controlling perception, shaping how others saw him, but none of that prepared him for a moment where the truth stood so plainly in front of him that it could not be reinterpreted. "Then play again," he said finally, his voice steady but different now, stripped of the earlier edge, carrying something closer to respect than challenge. A subtle movement passed through the audience, heads turning, attention sharpening once more, but this time it was not anticipation of spectacle, it was something quieter, something more sincere. Clara studied him for a brief moment, her expression unreadable, as if weighing not the request, but the intention behind it. "Why?" she asked softly. The single word held no defiance, only clarity. Victor hesitated, not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer he once would have given no longer felt honest. "Because they deserve to hear it," he said, glancing toward the audience, then back at her. "And because I think. I do too." The admission was subtle, but it changed everything. The man who had once stood as the authority in the room was now asking, not commanding. Clara's gaze lingered on him for another second, then shifted briefly toward the piano, the instrument that had carried her voice long before anyone in this room had known her name. For a moment, it seemed as though she might decline, might step back into the quiet life she had chosen, leaving this moment exactly where it stood. But then, without a word, she turned and walked back toward the bench. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and this time, no one mistook it for anything less than intention. Victor stepped aside completely, creating space not out of courtesy, but out of understanding. He no longer belonged at the center of this moment. Clara sat down once more, her posture the same, calm and grounded, her hands resting gently before lifting again to the keys. The room held its breath, but it was no longer the same kind of silence. There was no judgment in it now, no expectation of failure, only attention, only listening. Her fingers touched the piano again, and this time, the sound that emerged was different. Not a continuation of what had come before, but something new, something softer, more reflective, as if the music itself had shifted from revelation to expression. The melody unfolded slowly, each note carrying a depth that felt personal, not performed for the audience, but shared with them. Victor stood just a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her hands, but his expression no longer searching for flaws. Instead, he listened, truly listened, in a way he had not allowed himself to before. The audience remained completely still, the earlier energy of the hall transformed into something almost reverent. A man in the back lowered his phone entirely, no longer interested in recording, only in experiencing. A woman near the front closed her eyes, letting the music settle without distraction. Clara's playing was not about proving anything now. It was not about skill or recognition or reclaiming something lost. It was simply truth, and that truth carried through the room in a way that no performance ever could. Victor felt it in the silence between the notes, in the absence of pretense, in the way the music did not seek approval but existed fully on its own. For the first time, he understood the difference. When the final note of the second piece faded, it did not leave behind tension or shock. It left behind stillness, a quiet, undeniable stillness that no one rushed to break. Clara lifted her hands slowly, letting them rest once more, her eyes opening as she looked out across the room, not searching, not expecting, simply present. Victor exhaled softly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his shoulders lowering in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. He stepped forward slightly, not to reclaim the stage, but to stand beside her, not above, not ahead, but beside. And in that moment, the shift was complete. The man who had once defined the room was now part of it. The woman who had once been invisible had become the center without ever asking for it. And as the silence stretched just a moment longer, filled not with uncertainty, but with understanding, Victor realized something that could not be undone. Mastery is not proven by how loudly it is recognized. It is revealed in the moments when nothing needs to be said at all. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire hall had forgotten how to respond to something that could not be categorized, judged, or neatly applauded. And in that suspended stillness, the meaning of what had just happened settled deeper than any sound ever could. Clara remained seated at the piano, her hands now resting quietly in her lap, her posture unchanged, grounded, as if the weight of the moment belonged more to the room than to her. Victor stood beside her, no longer the focal point, no longer the authority the audience had arrived to see, but a witness to something that had quietly redefined the entire evening. The silence stretched, not awkward, not uncertain, but full, as if every person present was processing the same realization at the same time. Then, somewhere near the front row, a single pair of hands came together. The sound was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it broke the stillness just enough to allow the rest to follow. Another pair joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall rose into applause, not explosive, not performative, but steady, deliberate, growing in strength as the understanding deepened. This was not admiration for a performance alone. It was recognition. Clara did not react immediately. She did not stand, did not bow, did not acknowledge the applause in the way performers are trained to do. Instead, she simply sat there for a moment longer, as if allowing the sound to pass through her rather than toward her. When she finally stood, her movements were calm, almost understated, her presence unchanged despite the shift that had taken place around her. Victor watched her, the applause echoing around them, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of his earlier actions, not as embarrassment, but as clarity. He had not simply underestimated her. He had misunderstood what mattered. He took a small step forward, raising a hand slightly, not to silence the audience, but to gather just enough attention for his voice to carry. The applause softened, then gradually faded, the room once again settling into a quiet that now felt entirely different from before. Victor turned toward Clara, his expression no longer guarded, no longer distant, but open in a way that surprised even him. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady, clear, and unforced. The words hung in the air, simple, but powerful in their honesty. A subtle shift moved through the audience again, not in sound, but in attention, as they leaned in, not for drama, but for truth. Clara looked at him, her gaze calm, not expectant, not dismissive, simply present. Victor continued, choosing his words carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the moment. "I assumed I understood who belonged on this stage," he said, glancing briefly around the hall before returning his focus to her. "And I was wrong." There was no attempt to soften the statement, no justification, no defense. Just acknowledgement. Clara held his gaze for a moment, her expression unchanged, but her eyes reflecting something deeper, something that recognized the sincerity in his words without needing to validate them. "It is easy to assume," she replied quietly. "It is harder to listen." The simplicity of her response carried the same quiet authority as her music, and Victor felt it settle in a place he could not ignore. He nodded slightly, accepting it, not as a correction, but as a truth he would carry forward. The room remained silent again, but this time it was not waiting for something to happen. It was absorbing what already had. A member of the orchestra shifted, then slowly stood, followed by another, and then another, until one by one, the musicians rose to their feet. It was not rehearsed. It was not prompted. It was instinctive. Respect, expressed not through obligation, but through recognition. Clara noticed, her gaze moving briefly across them, but she did not linger on it. Recognition, for her, did not seem to hold the same weight it did for others. Victor turned slightly toward the audience, then back to her, as if realizing that the moment was no longer about him, not even about the performance, but about something far more fundamental. "Will you stay?" he asked, the question quiet, almost uncertain, carrying none of the authority he once held. "There is more we could learn from you." The words were not a request for collaboration, not an attempt to reclaim the stage, but an acknowledgement of value he had only just begun to understand. Clara paused, considering the question, not the opportunity, not the recognition, but the meaning behind it. Her gaze shifted once more to the piano, then back to Victor, her expression thoughtful, but grounded. "This was never about staying," she said softly. "It was about being seen." The words settled into the room, final in a way that required no further explanation. Victor nodded slowly, understanding not fully, but enough. Clara took a step back, then another, returning toward the edge of the stage, toward the space where she had once existed unnoticed. But this time, every eye followed her. Not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with awareness. And as she reached the shadows beyond the stage lights, something became undeniably clear to everyone in that room. She had never needed the spotlight to prove her worth. The spotlight had needed her to reveal its limits. The applause faded slowly, not because it lacked energy, but because something deeper had replaced the need for sound. And as Clara disappeared beyond the edge of the stage lights, the room remained still, as if no one wanted to be the first to return to what this evening had once been. Victor stood alone near the piano, the polished surface now reflecting a version of him that felt unfamiliar, quieter, more aware, stripped of the certainty that had once defined every step he took. The chandeliers above still cast the same golden light, the audience still sat in the same rows, the orchestra still waited in place, but nothing about the room felt the same anymore. He looked down at the keys, his reflection bending across their glossy surface, and for a moment, he did not move. Not because he did not know what to do, but because he finally understood that knowing what to do was not the same as knowing why. A soft murmur began to rise from the audience, not gossip, not confusion, but conversation, thoughtful and measured, as if everyone present had been given something they were not ready to lose. A man in the third row leaned toward his companion, speaking quietly, his tone no longer impressed, but reflective. A woman near the aisle glanced back toward the wings where Clara had exited, her expression thoughtful, as if she had just witnessed something that would stay with her long after the evening ended. Victor exhaled slowly, then lifted his hands, placing them lightly on the piano, not to perform, not to reclaim attention, but to feel the instrument in a way he never had before. The keys felt the same beneath his fingers, smooth, familiar, but the meaning behind them had shifted. He pressed a single note, softly, testing the sound, but it did not carry the same weight it once did. Not because the instrument had changed, but because he had. He withdrew his hands almost immediately, letting the note fade into the space where Clara's music had once filled every corner. It was not emptiness that followed. It was perspective. The conductor at the edge of the stage stepped forward slightly, as if preparing to resume the evening, but then paused, glancing toward Victor, waiting for direction that no longer felt necessary. Victor turned, meeting his gaze, then gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Not tonight. The conductor understood without words and stepped back, allowing the moment to remain untouched. The audience slowly began to rise, not in a rush, not eager to leave, but moving with a kind of quiet respect, as if departing from something that had meant more than they expected. Conversations remained low, measured, thoughtful. No one laughed. No one dismissed what had happened as a coincidence or a curiosity. It had been too clear for that. Too undeniable. Victor stepped away from the piano, his movements slower than before, not burdened, but grounded in a way that felt new. He glanced once more toward the wings, where Clara had disappeared, and for a brief moment, he considered following, not to question, not to challenge, but simply to understand. But he did not move, because for the first time, he realized that understanding does not come from chasing answers. It comes from recognizing the questions you failed to ask. The stage lights dimmed slightly, softening the edges of the room, and the grand hall began to return to its ordinary state. Staff members moved quietly along the sides, resetting, preparing, restoring order. And somewhere among them, just another figure in a simple uniform, Clara Bennett walked once more through the space she had always occupied, unnoticed by most, but not by those who had truly seen her. She picked up a cloth from a small cart near the wall, her movements calm, familiar, as if nothing about the evening had changed her routine. But everything had changed the way the world would see it. A young musician, no older than 20, paused as she passed, his eyes lingering on her with a mixture of awe and curiosity, as if he wanted to speak, but did not yet know how. Clara offered a small, polite nod, then continued walking, her presence quiet, steady, unchanged. She did not stop. She did not explain. She did not claim anything that had just been revealed, because she did not need to. Back on the stage, Victor stood for one final moment, the echoes of the evening settling into something he knew would follow him far beyond this hall. He had spent years building a name, shaping an identity, defining himself through recognition and applause. But tonight had shown him something far more difficult to accept. Greatness does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It does not need permission to exist. It simply waits, quiet and unshaken, until the world is ready to see it. And sometimes, the world only becomes ready after it has been proven wrong. Victor lowered his gaze slightly, a faint, almost reflective smile touching his expression, not of triumph, not of pride, but of understanding. The kind that comes too late to prevent a mistake, but just in time to learn from it. And as the last of the audience stepped out into the cool night air, carrying the memory of what they had witnessed, one truth remained, steady and undeniable. Respect is not given to those who demand it. It belongs to those who never needed it in the first place.